Take your Bibles and open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And if you're using a Pew Bible, you'll find it on page 1781. Next week, we're going to be into the God questions. There is a slip of paper in there, I'll let you know, that's going to bring us up to Christmas over the next 5 or 6 weeks. And then this morning, my friend Ron Perry, the Reverend Ron Perry, is going to come and bring the word to you. Ron is the CEO of Radix International. He's founded and successfully run a number of companies. Ron was born in this area, and he's a graduate from Rutgers and Biblical Theological Seminary. I got to know Ron when I was teaching math at the high school, when I was thinking about going to seminary. And Ron was pastoring Evangel Baptist Church over in Springfield. And I had a number of pastors trying to direct me to this seminary or that seminary. You know, it's trying to discern the Lord's will sometimes is very 20/20. It's hindsight. And when the dust clears and you see how God works, you say, it's amazing, God. And Ron was a piece of that puzzle in my life as he directed me to go to biblical. And then also, that's personally, knowing him over these years. And then for us, you most of you don't know this, but when personal computers became necessary back in the late 80s, mid to late 80s, Ron and some of his friends were actually providing training for churches over in New York City to use computers, and our church went for 5 days. It was a whole week of learning how to use a computer, and that was back then. This is now. It's so much more now. So with that in mind, would you give a warm Crossroads greeting to my friend Ron Perry?
Thank you. God bless. Thank you, Tom. It is great to be here this morning. It is just such a blessing. I'm a New Jersey boy. I was born in Manhattan, but I think I was 2 minutes old when we moved to Plainfield, New Jersey, and then spent some years there in Madison, worked over in Cranford, exit 136 on the Parkway at IBM, and then Basking Ridge and Chester, and lived in Springfield for quite a few years when I was pastoring. And we love this area. And I think there's an honesty and a reality with the people who are here. I live in the South and people are so polite. You don't always know where they stand. They may hate your guts, but they're really nice to you. Here, you know where you stand, right? And it's an amazing place. Remember Newark years ago? Wow, Christmas time, most fantastic thing. You go to Bamberger's or S. Klein or on the square or Kresge, and one of them, I don't remember which one, but had a monorail that went all the way around the store, and as kids we could go on that. It was fantastic, and people would go there to see the Christmas lights. That was just phenomenal, and that was a time where you could drive down there, leave packages on the back seat of your car, leave the doors unlocked, and you go back later and the packages were still there, the car was still there, the wheels were still there. A different time. Things have changed. And so, I wanted to talk a little bit today about what Paul was dealing with in a pagan culture, in the kind of culture, sadly, that we're becoming. Now, Tom and I knew one another through Evangel and through Biblical. What I didn't know when I was a student there, and I only found out when I graduated, and I went to work for Biblical for a year, was that my freshman year there, those professors, in fact, some of you have heard them, Professor Harding, Professor Newman, Professor Taylor, did not get paid for one whole year. Can you imagine any group of people that you know today who would go for a year without getting paid and never tell anyone? They didn't strike. They didn't walk off the job. They were called by God to serve him. Jack Murray, the chairman of our board and one of the founders, was fond of saying, God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. And those men wound up always having enough to eat, always having a roof over their heads, were able to take care of their children well. God provided. God provided. They never complained because they knew they were working for God and not the administration. They were working for God and doing his will. 1 Corinthians 9. This particular section is in context. Somebody has said a text without a context is a pretext. I don't know who said that. If you don't know, then I said it. Okay. Now, actually, the context here is this. Paul is having to deal with criticism from people in Corinth who are saying, he's not a real apostle. You know, he's not like Peter. He's not like John. And part of the proof was he's supporting himself. He's still working. And that was part of his proof. And so he said, look, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? He brought the gospel to them initially. He lived with them for 3 years. He discipled them. He says, even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Those are the first few verses of chapter 9. This is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Of course we do. Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us? Of course we do. He says, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas, that's Peter. Or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? And he says, who serves as a soldier at his own expense? And in essence, he's saying, I do. Who plants a vineyard and does not eat of its grapes? He says, that's me. And so he goes through and he makes this argument and he says, look, it is right to support men and women in ministry. That is the normal model. We need them. Where would this area be without this church? Think of the number of people's lives who have been touched. The transformations, the families, the children. Where would you turn if this church didn't exist and other churches? And yet, these are challenging times for churches. The scriptures tell us that it is right to support your pastor. It is right to support missionaries. There are certain jobs that can only be done if those who are ministered to wind up ministering back to the person who is encouraging and shepherding them. On the front of your programs, I think it's in the upper right-hand corner, there is a word. Is that where that is? Okay, and you'll find that word, and it says minister. Now, for me, in my life, when I came to the Lord, that's what I was called to be, a minister. But as things turned out, I came to understand that word very differently from what I once understood it to mean. Paul writes here and he says, look, I've become a slave to everyone. Now, that is not the most desirable thing. I mean, if I went home when I was a kid and said, look, my goal when I grow up is to be a slave, that's not what people want. We don't want to serve others. We want to be served. We want all the conveniences of life, and we want people to recognize us as important, and we want them to serve us. You go to a restaurant, and if you're not served well, people get upset. But Paul says, I become a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. He said, to the Jews, I became like a Jew. To those under the law, I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law, I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under Christ's law. A new command I give you, that you love one another even as I have loved you. That's a form of slavery. Is a mother who would sacrifice everything for her little baby a slave? That's the ultimate demonstration of love. Is a man who dies on the cross for the sake of others, though he is innocent, is he a slave? The ultimate act of love. God, here is a man dying for us. He said, I've done all of this so as to win those not having the law. To the weak, I became weak. And then he says this, and he sums it up. I have become all things to all men, to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. Now, that word means in any and every way, using any method. So by any method, whatever it takes, my goal is, so Paul says, my goal is to save as many people as I can in this life, to share the good news of what God has done for me with others. Things change. Newark is not like it once was. America is not like it once was. And we see that the one constant all around us is change. We see it in history. We see it when we look at businesses. General Motors. Okay, many people here drive a car that was manufactured by General Motors. In 1953, Charles Wilson, the president of GM, said, what's good for General Motors is good for America. In 2008, General Motors declared bankruptcy. Pennsylvania Railroad. You remember the Pennsylvania Railroad, you remember the Penn Central, you remember the Lackawanna, you remember a lot of the other railroads. Well, Pennsylvania Railroad was once the largest publicly traded corporation in the world. They had a budget larger than the annual budget of the United States government at one point. Hard to believe. They paid dividends for 100 years in a row. These were the bluest of the blue chip stocks at one point. Paying dividends for 100 years in a row. This was the stock, Pennsylvania Railroad, or General Motors, that anyone who had a fiduciary responsibility would recommend to someone else, even to the elderly, put your money in General Motors, put your money in Pennsylvania Railroad. You can bank on this. This is solid. And then what happened? 1970, they declared bankruptcy. What about the church? In 1954, I remember these days, some here do. For others, it's slightly after the Earth's crust hardened. Okay, but I remember when President Eisenhower signed it into law. The Senate voted on it, the House voted on it. The decision of the government, the decision of the Supreme Court, because they didn't overrule it, the decision of everyone was, we need to add this phrase to the Pledge of Allegiance so that every school child would make a commitment every day to this country and recognize that this nation is under God and under his authority. One nation under God added to the Pledge of Allegiance. But I was in Bratislava a few years back. I didn't even know where Bratislava was until I got there, but it's in the Slovak Republic, used to be part of Czechoslovakia. And I was walking through the old town, and I came into a square. You know, if you've been to Europe at all, they have plazas and piazzas and so on. They'll have these big squares, and there'll be buildings all around. It's a particularly big one. And at the far end was this church. Now, you may not be able to see it easily from where you are, and I couldn't see it either when I walked into the square, but I saw it was a striking structure. And as I got closer, I could start to make it out. And maybe you can see right by the lamppost, there's an M, and then a U, and then a Z, and then an E, and then a U, and then an M. It is now a museum. And as you travel around Europe, what you'll find is these beautiful, beautiful buildings, churches that had been built sometimes over generations and represented the commitment of faith of people over hundreds of years. They're museums. I was in Belgium, went up to one gorgeous, very, very, very large church. It had been a Reformed church preaching the gospel during the Reformation. It was fantastic. They had a church service. It was in a few pews in the back of the church every Sunday. And they had museum hours. And as people went through, it was primarily people visiting a museum who were there. You can look around even today, not too far from here, and find buildings that at one point housed people of faith. America in the 1780s, let's just go back there for a few moments and see where we started. 9 of the 10 pre-revolutionary universities were founded to train men for ministry. By the way, the one exception was the University of Pennsylvania, where Ben Franklin designed the field house so that the great preacher of the First Great Awakening, George Whitefield, would have a place to preach indoors. Whitefield was able to preach and be heard by up to 30,000 people in the open air without amplification. God did not bless me with that kind of a voice. I struggle even with amplification. But can you imagine? And so that's the one university that wasn't founded specifically to train men for ministry. Harvard, the motto was Veritas, truth in Latin, pro Christos et ecclesia. And if you go to Harvard Yard, you'll see etched in stone, Veritas pro Christos et ecclesia, truth for Christ and the church. Do you know, Harvard shortened their motto just to Veritas. Veritas for Latin purists, and I do see one Latin professor here, Magister. And there's no truth there now. You don't send your children to Harvard in a quest for the truth. You certainly don't send them there now in order to find God. People may go there in order to get a better job when they graduate, to place themselves on the pathway to get to the upper echelon of earners, but to find God, to be trained, it's changed. Public schools met in churches. The whole concept of a one-room schoolhouse is because this would be the room for your kids, because the churches were where the parents got together and saw that their kids were trained. The curriculum was based on the Bible, even math, every aspect of the curriculum. The New England Primer started out, in Adam's fall we sinned all. Some of you are more familiar with the McGuffey Reader, same type of thing. All of those books were designed to teach people about Jesus Christ. You may remember Abraham Lincoln had one textbook. His mother homeschooled him. His textbook was the Bible. He did okay. 1780, state governments. 11 of 13 states had state churches. Do you know who didn't? Can you guess? The Baptist colony, Rhode Island, did not. Roger Williams had been imprisoned and had been put in stocks, had actually been scourged for baptizing believers against the law in Congregationalist Massachusetts. So when he was able to get a charter for the colony of Rhode Island, he said, we will not have a state church. Now, that was an incredible risk. People thought he would certainly fail because popular wisdom at the time was the church cannot exist unless it is supported by the government. People were taxed in order to fund the churches in the colonies. Not in Rhode Island. And then the second was in Virginia. Thomas Jefferson opposed the Anglican Church in that role and felt that the colony would be better without a church, and so he sought to disestablish the church. Those who were against him in this were called anti-disestablishmentarians. So now you know where that word came from. That used to be the longest word in English. Massachusetts had a church, a state church, until 1838. Can you imagine? You know the First Amendment. How can this be? Congress shall make no law respecting the establishment of religion or denying the free exercise thereof. Well, the reason it can be is because they understood it very differently. They understood that this is just a matter for the states to decide. States can do anything they want. It's just not a federal issue. You know, insofar as whether there's a state church, what people say, what people do. The states are free to decide. Holding office required a statement of faith. Atheists could not testify in court or hold public office in any of the states in the 1780s. George Washington, at his farewell address, so the last words he was saying to the people, typically the most important, he said, "And let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. Now think about that. What he's saying is that this form of government, which was a great experiment, only works if the people are moral. It only works if the people are concerned about others. It's wholly inadequate, he said, to the government of any other. So as we work hard, or certainly as elements in America work hard to remove religion and remove Christianity and remove all aspects of various religion from the marketplace, from the government, from the schools, that's not what our form of government was designed for. And the question is, can it still work? They embarked on this great experiment. Let people govern themselves. James Madison said, we've staked the whole future of American civilization not on the power of the government, far from it. We have staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind to self-govern. In other words, individuals to govern themselves first. How can you hire somebody to do a job where they are running something, a big group of people, a big company, or whatever, if they can't run their own lives? Even more, how can you let people vote and make the decisions if their vote is only going to be what's best for me? And so he says, we've staked the future of all of our political institutions upon the capacity of mankind for self-government, upon the capacity of each and all of us to govern ourselves according to, well, I'm not allowed to say this. Well, I can say it here in the church. Can't say it out there. According to the 10 Commandments of God, systematically, people have been removing the 10 Commandments. I travel around the world. I go to a lot of countries where they've never had the 10 Commandments influence their societies. Things like, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, thou shalt not murder. What happens, do you think, when people are raised without the basic limitations? They grew up without love your neighbor as yourself. Who do you think they love? No man yet has hated his own flesh, Paul said. We take care of ourselves. Okay, and what the founder said was you can't build a government, you can't build a country if people only care about themselves, if it's me first. And so they put the 10 Commandments out there, and we have systematically removed them from the schools, from government, from everywhere. What happens when you do that? What do you build the base of a government on? Well, during the time that we had that, America flourished. Alexis de Tocqueville, when he came here, a Frenchman, wanted to see why was it that America was so great even then? So there's no country in the world where the Christian religion retains a greater influence over the souls of men than in America. He said he searched for the greatness of America everywhere, and he ultimately found it in the churches. The engine of the greatness of America, according to de Tocqueville, as he traveled coast to coast, the churches. Here's a fact. We're not that country anymore. Franklin Roosevelt was speaking on the eve of World War II. The war clouds were darkening, and he had to give a message to America. It was a very controversial message he was going to give. And he said, I have received telegrams asking me to be positive in speaking of the threat and to not scare the people. And he said, this all can be summed up as, please, Mr. President, don't frighten us by telling us the facts. There are a lot of people who don't want to know the facts today. They want to presume that everything's just going to continue on as it once was. It's not. It will continue on in a decline unless something changes. The fact is that the culture is collapsing. Broken homes. When I was a kid growing up in Madison, New Jersey, I didn't know a single family where there was a divorce. The only single-parent home in our neighborhood, not just our neighborhood, but that I knew of, was a home where the father had died in the Korean War. 57 million abortions. If we only had more consumers, if we could drive consumer demand, we're told, the economy would turn around overnight. Well, of those 57 million, over 30 would right now be in the workforce. They would be paying taxes. They would be paying their Social Security. They would be buying houses. They would be buying appliances. They'd be buying cars. Lots of people would be employed just to service the needs of them. But we killed them. We killed them. People understand, particularly the elderly, that Social Security is dependent upon more people coming into the workforce. We systematically and over time took 57 million potential workers out of our workforce. Immigrants and others have come in to fill the void. Bullying, unknown years ago, hot topic today. Coarseness in the media. The lessons taught when you watch a movie, when you watch a sitcom or whatever, very different from what you would have seen 50 years ago, 40 years ago even. Cheating in schools, schoolhouse shootings. Now you have unknown in my lifetime, in most people here's lifetime. Collapse of personal credit. When you have the kind of breakdown we're talking about, credit goes. We have clients all over the world. Most of the world is cash-based. People don't get credit. You can't get a mortgage to begin with. Your whole family saves up the best they can. You buy a plot of land. Then you save more, and maybe after another 5 or 6 years, you put down a foundation. Then a few more years, and maybe you put up some walls. And if you work at it hard enough, and sometimes more than one generation, you can actually build a little compound and put walls around your property and a gate in front. Travel all over the world, and you'll see this repeated over and over and over again where there is no credit. Well, credit comes from trust. The word credito in Latin means to trust. And if you don't have trust, you don't have credit. If you don't have credit, you can't build a great society. It is not by accident that we had a credit crisis and are still in it. Because if your raw culture, underlying culture changes, you can't create what you need to have the economic engine, which is you need credit. The government's broke. 17 trillion in debt. Now, a lot of that is because people have come to depend on the government. Remember, Madison said don't depend on the government. Washington said don't depend on the government. That was never the plan. But we depend on the government. We pray to the government. Please, Mr. President. Please, Mr. Senator. Please, Mr. Congressman. We have a crisis. You need to take care of it. And it's going to take money. We have a crisis in education. We have a crisis with Ebola. We have a crisis in the hospitals. We have a crisis with pick something. Please, I'm out of work. Take care of me. Please. And so the government tries to play God. Look, there are people who desperately want to help others. But the government's not God. It's not omnipotent. It's not omniscient. It does things sometimes in a very blundering and heavy-handed way. God is the one we have to trust. Vices have been legalized and taxed to bring in more revenue. How well has that worked out for Atlantic City? How well is it working out in Colorado with marijuana? We're now to a point where preachers in Houston are having sermons reviewed. I don't know if you saw that in the news, but the Attorney General in Houston has requested specifically 6 pastors provide their sermons for this past several months. Okay, and you're familiar probably with how the IRS has threatened some Christian organizations and created problems. We're at a different point. Fact, the impact of the church is fading. By more than a 3-to-1 margin, Americans believe professional sports players have more influence on society than do faith leaders. But here's the good news. The hunger for God is not fading. Tim Tebow put John 3:16 on his eye black before the BCS College Bowl game. 92 million people conducted a web search and read John 3:16 within the next 24 hours. Huntington Post, Time Magazine, CNN, a variety of others, all printed John 3:16, and most of them explained its meaning. Now, his parents were missionaries. He reached more people in one day than any missionary in the history of the world, getting John 3:16 to them. Why? Because the culture is changing, and we have to see where is it going and how do we take advantage of that. Paul wrote to a pagan culture much worse than ours, and in one generation they changed the world. Perhaps the problem's our method. Chuck Colson said modern Christianity is in the same place homosexuality was in 50 years ago. It's okay if practiced by consenting adults in the privacy of their own homes, but it should not be flaunted in public. Howard Hendricks, who was a professor at Dallas Seminary, said, the church today is like a football game. 50,000 spectators desperately in need of exercise, watching 22 men desperately in need of rest. And so we have bet everything on a relative handful of pastors and missionaries. And we've said, yeah, you all go. Yeah, you go forward in there. We'll support you. One church was praying for a new pastor, and they said, Lord, send us someone who's poor and humble to be our pastor. You keep him humble, we'll keep him poor. Paul wrote and he said, don't muzzle the oxen as he's threshing out the grain. It is right for pastors and for missionaries to be supported, but it's not enough. There's a whole army expecting the generals to fight. And now we have to engage the army. Jim Bjornstadt called me. He said, I don't know whether to laugh or to cry. He said, an elderly woman just called me and asked me to hire 4 or 5 of our students to go door to door sharing the gospel. Isn't that just like the church? We want to hire people to do the work of ministry. But the reality is, my dilemma was coming to the Lord as an adult, called to be a minister, pastoring an evangel, teaching a Bible study in Madison, some towns away. Church work was hard. It was hard to reach people with the gospel within the church because only people who would come in the doors of the church were easily reachable. But at 6:30 in the morning, we had 150 guys who came out, and they'd sit on the edge of their seats for crumbs. I'd work hard all week to prepare a good message, and on Fridays, 6:30, these guys were growing like weeds. I said, there's something wrong with this picture. As a pastor, people often discounted what I was saying. It was like the fire chief talking about fire safety. You have to say that because you're paid for it. As a businessman, I sat down and talked with somebody about Jesus. It was a conversation about Jesus. We talked about real stuff. So I said, what would Paul do? And I went through and I saw that in Corinth, he was a tent maker. Portable home construction was his business. And he put together a little LLC with Aquila and Priscilla. And that's how he supported himself in Corinth. In Ephesus, and you read about in Acts 20, he says, my hands supplied my own needs and the needs of those who were with me, my companions. In everything I did, I showed you that by this kind of hard work we must help the weak. He said, I'm as an example for you. In 2 Thessalonians, he says, we worked day and night, laboring and toiling so that we would not be a burden to any of you. We did this, he says, in order to offer ourselves as a model for you to imitate. In 1 Corinthians 9, the whole thing is about the fact that he and Barnabas are supporting themselves, and he's defending that. And so it turns out that Paul's model, in a pagan and non-Christian world, he just runs a little business. Not a big business, just a little business, enough to support himself. He's nothing great in terms of his appearance. Balding, middle-aged, stooped, scarred, poor vision, weak speaker, he says about himself. But he's great because of the power of God that lives within him. And his purpose in doing it in this way and supporting himself is, I did this as an example for you. Pastors have a right to be supported, but each of us is called to have this kind of ministry in the day-to-day. And Paul was just saying, I'm stepping into your world to show you how to do this. And as I read this, I said, I need to do that. Paul, the Christian everyman, he's our model. Instead of asking what would Jesus do, I thought he was divine. How did Paul do it? How did he make a go of it? He wasn't a pastor. People knew him as Paul the tent maker. You may be known as Joe the electrician. You may be known as a housewife. You may be known as any number of different things. That is how you make a living. But the truth of the matter is every Christian is a minister. In Ephesians 4, we read that the pastors are given to equip the people for their works of ministry. We're the ministers. So when it says on the front of your bulletin, minister, Tom's a minister to us, but we all here are the ministers. The only choice is how you get paid. These are some people who were just average folks at one point. D.L. Moody, a shoe salesman. Charles Finney, a lawyer, the great pastor and preacher of the Second Great Awakening. John Wanamaker, a business owner. Bill Bright, founder of Campus Crusade, a candy store owner. Art DeMoss, Power for Living and so many other things. Joanne Sheptock, a housewife. And Tim Tebow, a football player reaching the world. Paul and Barnabas, a couple of working guys who turned the world upside down. Why not you and me? Why not? That's what we're called for. Our whole lives, one life, dedicated to God. It may be that we derive our income from one place or another. That doesn't define us. What defines us is that God himself, in the form of his Holy Spirit, lives within us, and Jesus is reliving his life in us as a housewife, as a father, as an engineer, as a carpenter, as an electrician. I become all things to all people so that by all possible methods I might save some. And in this church, we have a whole lot of different methods. We each have our little congregation, group of people that is ours to reach, ours to intercede for, ours to pray for. And Jesus says, in your going, make disciples. That great command, the command is actually make disciples. The therefore go is actually a mistranslation. In the Greek it says, in your going. You're going anyway. As you're going, make disciples wherever you are. God bless you.